So, this week in the Sacred Gathering, we get stuck looking at the book of Job again. Job, of course, is the Old Testament book, this long poetic epic dealing with the problem of evil in the world and what is the meaning of suffering and where is God's place in this. Um, I was struck in kind of my readings, my prep this week, by kind of a different angle. I think we're gonna look at this a little differently than we have before. We did talk through kind of a lot of this material, um, and just kind of a general overview of Job not that long ago in our sacred gathering. But I don't know if it was just spending too much time with poets a couple weekends ago, but I just felt very drawn to kind of some of the language in this, some of the feel and some of the imagery, and was kind of reminded again that I think people are very frustrated with this book because it presents a situation in which the Bible, if it wanted to, could definitively answer. What is God's relationship to evil? Why is the world the way it is? And yet it doesn't. It doesn't give direct answers, I think, in the way that some of the characters want, in the way that we often want. And yet I think it is offering maybe answers to a different set of questions we often bring to these. Yeah, I think it's just kind of a good way to approach the book is maybe more the feel, the imagery, the way a poet would. So let's see if there's anything there. So let me start by reading the section we're going to look at. It's the traditional reading is kind of a stitching together of two different sections. It's the beginning of God's response to Job and his friends, and then it's a section a little further on in that same chapter in which he's kind of switching gears and starts talking about some other things. So let me read that just to start out. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, "Who is this that darkens my counsel by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man, and I will question you, and you will make it known to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? And what were its bases sunk? Who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy." Then skipping up to verse 34. "Can you lift up your voice to the clouds, that the flood of waters may cover you? Can you send forth lightnings, that they may go and say, 'Here we are'? Who has put wisdom in the inward parts, or given understanding to the mind? Who can number the clouds by wisdom? Who can tilt the water skins of the heavens, when the dust runs into a mass and the clods stick fast together? Can you hunt the prey of the lion, or satisfy the appetite of young lions, when they crouch in their dens or lie in wait in the thicket? Who provides for the raven its prey, when its young ones cry to God for help and wander about for lack of food?" So, as I said, this response tends to drive people kind of crazy. But I think in many ways, God's response, uh, it just kind of changes the tone. If you think about it, up until this point in Job, they've been going round and round with these kind of philosophical arguments, and they largely come down to his friends kind of saying, well, the world is just, God must have a plan for this thing, therefore this is your fault, or you should admit it, right? Cause and effect, there's meaning here. And Job again and again kind of invalidating that with his own pain, saying, I didn't do anything wrong. I don't deserve this. Why are we having this argument? Well, you must have done that. And it goes round and round. And one of the commentaries I read said, it's kind of interesting that God shows up, ending this argument, but he doesn't really even address this kind of long, round and around, tedious argument that the friends have been having. And I'm like, it is tedious, isn't it? It's like that conversation you've had with like that certain friend that you just don't see eye to eye with, right? You're not going to convince each other. You both are sure the other person is wrong. You've done it a million times. Oh, really, we're going to have this discussion again, and that's kind of the place we're going. It's gotten pretty dull. It's gotten pretty dark. And a lot of people have also pointed out that God's response not only ignores kind of the questions they're asking, which again frustrates a lot of people, But I was struck by, I'm kind of glad. I'm glad God didn't sit them down and refute their points one at a time, all these little intricate, nitpicky arguments that they're making about something that is immensely important. But they're approaching it wrong, right? I don't think you can philosophize. I don't think you can solve some of the questions about pain in the world, and that you can come up with actual answers for evil and the interaction of people's choices and the evil in the world and the world overall, right? And so God takes a very different approach. And I don't think it's that God is totally ignoring those things. I just think he's saying that you're asking the wrong questions about this. And a lot of people have seen God's response is not a response to the questions they're asking, kind of philosophically going back and forth, but it's actually a direct kind of rejection of where Job starts the whole thing. And that's what's sometimes called his death poem. He starts with something along the lines of, like, I wish I was dead. I wish I'd never been born. I wish that it was darkness and not light. I think the world is suffering and meaningless and darkness, and I want nothing to do with it anymore. And a lot of people have pointed out that God, where Job is saying that, life is meaningless and has a meaning and is darkness, God is saying the opposite. He's saying, no, the world is not meaningless. There is meaning to the world. There is planning in the world. And the world is not defined by darkness and things not making sense. It's defined by joy. It's defined by a fact, which again is a bit of a tough sell to Job as a person, as it is for us, as we are often experiencing places of pain. But I think that is very intentional as well. God is arguing that the world is good, but it is not necessarily comprehensible or contained within Job's own experiences, right? And so, one of the major things that God is doing is showing Job many good things in the world, things that God takes delight in that are totally outside of his experience. He shows it, in the section we read, talking about the foundations of the earth, talking about the stars, talking about the human mind, talking about animals and mountains and things that are just totally outside the experience of humanity, these things that are out there at the fringes that God knows and that God loves and delights in, that we really have no part in. And I think for Job, whose entire world, his entire experience, the way he is seeing the world as darkness, God is rejecting, saying, no, your experience and your personal pain makes you see the world in a certain way, but that's not the only way to see the world. Let me show you some other things that are not part of your experience, that are not part of your little self-contained world that is darkness and that is pain right now. And so it's interesting. Again, it feels like God is not answering these very direct questions that Job has. He's instead kind of changing the tone of the conversation. And it's interesting, it's pointed out in God's response. There are, just tons of images, but two are really kind of dominant. One is the image of light. And so, right as Job's, the first thing that God says to Job is, who is it that darkens my counsel? And I think a lot of people have realized that the play on words there is not just darkness representing like ignorance, like you don't know what you're talking about. Let me show you all the things you don't know. It's the lenses through which you're seeing everything are dark. May the day I was born be darkness. May the world be dark and fall apart again, right? Because I'm in pain right now. And God responds with many, many different types of light imagery. And we don't get it as much out of this section we read, but the other major metaphor, which actually was cut off in the traditional reading, but even verse 8 in this section launches into a new section that is going to use birth imagery and new life imagery. And the idea being that God is saying, it feels like the world is defined by death, but I define it by birth and new life and by light, not by darkness. And so these things that you are trying to define it by are not necessarily true. And I think God is trying to break down this space. It's interesting because the first time I read this, then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. And that quick little verse, I think we talked about this some last time, but one interesting thing about that is then the Lord, the all capital Lord, that's in the Old Testament, that's Yahweh, God's name, right? God's personal name, which is associated very heavily with the Exodus. So up until this point, in all the discussions between Job and his friends, they've used the more vague term for God, El or Elohim, God. But then here, for the first time, we get Yahweh back. We get the saving God back, the God who rescued people from the Red Sea and from empires like Pharaoh, right? So there's a little hint there that God is up to something. Very interestingly, we almost always translate this word as answered, right? The Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. There's a lesser known kind of meaning of the word, but a use that seems legitimate too, because it's a very specific word, and that is rescue. And in fact, this is the word that is used in Psalm 22, the one that Jesus quotes on the cross when it's taking that turn, right? It says, God, you have abandoned me, and yet I will trust in you. I trust that you are the one who is going to rescue me from everything. It's the same word. And so you could say, then the saving God, the God who saved in the Exodus, rescued Job out of this whirlwind and said, I don't know. It's not the only way to interpret it, but it was a very fascinating meaning to me. And I think one of the things that's so important about God's response here is, whereas Job is looking for answers, where the friends are looking for answers to the question of justice abstractly, right? Job doesn't really care about justice abstractly. He's talking about himself. I want to know why this is happening to me. I want to know, but I think he's become so narrow. His view is so small. God could sit down and explain all the reasons for this to him if he could even comprehend them, and it wouldn't matter, right? And so God instead kind of intervenes and goes into this dark little world and invites him out into a place in which the stars are singing with joy to see the world that God has made, in which new things are being birthed all the time, in which God is doing this like giant show and tell of the mountains and the stars and animals, and later on even monsters, right? These mythological monsters that probably represent like chaos generally in the world, and systems, the things we've made in the world that we can't control, that are beyond us. Even those things that strike us as frightening and outside, God recognizes even in chaos there are things to delight in that are beyond there. And I'm not sure Job could hear that invitation to come out of his own experience, his own pain, his own little world any other way. And so God invites, he steps in and invites Job into a different understanding of the world, in which it is not darkness, in which death does not rule, even though at this moment it is his experience. Though again, if we read to the end of Job, we know that that is not always the case. It's interesting that this passage was paired with one out of Hebrews chapter 5, in which Christ is being talked of as a priest. Again, a priest in the Old Testament is not someone who's better than everyone else. It's someone who is intervening on the behalf of others, which is, a very apt metaphor for what God chose to do in coming to earth and being. So I wanted to read that real quick because it's just an interesting contrast between the way Job speaks and the way God speaks, and the way God is inviting Job out of his own pain and suffering into a world that is good, even if that isn't Job's experience at the moment. And we can see that again in Jesus' life in so many ways. And in this passage, it's interesting, just again, that invitation, that intervention on Jesus' behalf, speaking in this case out of his own pain and suffering. For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sin. He can deal gently with the ignorant and the wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. Because of this, he obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people. And no one takes this honor for themselves, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was. so also Christ did not exalt himself to be made high priest, but was appointed by him who said to him, You are my son, today I have begotten you. And he also says in another place, You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. And so it's, again, interesting that God is using, even in Jesus' life, his pain as a place to intervene and to step in and to be with others. And I think an argument can be made that that's actually what Job is doing in some ways too. He is a Christ-like figure in some ways. He is suffering even though he doesn't have to, that those of us who read from this can learn from, and he can suffer and kind of take one for the team in some ways of immense suffering, and pondering the meaning of that in a way that that invitation from God can be extended to us as well when we are in places of pain, when our world is our experience of suffering. I think the invitation is still there from God. The world is not that. Death and darkness don't define things. And God is willing to use his own pain, just as Job will later offer a sacrifice for the sake of his friends who screwed up and talked about God the wrong way, right? And I think that's the invitation for each of us as well, to step out of those places of darkness and of pain, to listen to the just joy God has in this good world, but in this good world that is beyond many of our experiences, that is bigger than us, that God continues to invite us to if we're willing to hear him. So those conclusions come from skipping around a lot in Job. They come from listening to the tone and looking at the imagery. But I think that's what we're meant to do there, not get stuck in the details, not get stuck in our own feelings, experiences, maybe even our own answers of pain and suffering in the world. The invitation is to come and see, just as Jesus invited people so many times, right? Come and see who I am and what I do. Come and see out of the world you're currently experiencing. Let me show you what the world is really like.